Chapter 1. The Thorin of Eldur. In the waning years of the Middle Ages, a figure raced across the desolate expanse of Siberia's frozen tundra. Eldur, as he was once known among the secretive covens of the night, stumbled through the harsh, icy winds. His long black coat flapped wildly behind him, the frayed edges whipped by the merciless gusts. His breaths formed fleeting clouds of vapor in the freezing air, as the pale fingers of dawn crept over the horizon. Eldur's heart, though seldom stirred by fear, pounded with the terror of the approaching light. Sunlight was anathema to his kind, a fatal embrace he could not survive. Behind him, the distant shouts of a relentless mob echoed over the ice. They were hunters, merciless and singular in their purpose to purge the land of his ancient curse. "Let them take me," he murmured, his voice a mere wisp of defeat against the howling wind. Hunger gnawed at him, an insatiable, torturous hunger that had driven him to desperation and now to potential doom. With each labored step, the light crept closer, a silent hunter greater than any wielding torch or pitchfork. Eldur's eyes, once a vibrant emerald, now dulled with exhaustion and hunger, scanned the bleak landscape for refuge. There was none, only ice, endless and unforgiving. In his peripheral vision, a dark opening caught his attention, a hidden ice pool, a potential tomb or sanctuary from the biting rays of the sun. As the first rays of sunlight singed the edges of his cloak, Eldur slipped into the ice pool. The cold was immediate and brutal, seizing his limbs, encasing him in a crystalline prison. As the ice closed over him, the world above faded into a muffled silence, the cries of the mob dimming and then disappearing. Eldur was alone, suspended in time. Centuries passed in darkness. When the thaw came, it was subtle at first. The ice around Eldor wept, droplets of water tracing paths through the thawing frost, and then, with a suddenness that startled even the ancient creature, he was free. The ice surrendered, its captive to a world utterly transformed. Eldur emerged into a landscape still dominated by ice, but the silence he had known for ages was gone, replaced by a low, constant moaning. The sun, hidden behind a heavy veil of grey clouds, provided little warmth but enough light to reveal a chilling sight. Hordes of undead, zombies, roamed the tundra, their bodies decayed, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. They were everywhere, a sea of rotting flesh, yet they paid him no heed. Walking among them, Eldur felt an eerie sense of invisibility. These creatures, driven by a primal hunger not unlike his own, seemed unaware of his presence. His own hunger, however, grew more acute with each passing moment. Where could he find the living in this dead world? Was there any warmth of blood left on this frozen, forsaken earth? He wandered, driven by the ancient instinct to survive, his eyes always searching the horizon. Then, atop a desolate ridge, Eldor stopped. He looked out over the vast, icy landscape, the undead drifting like shadows below. His mind, sharp as ever, raced with plans and possibilities. How would he feed? How could he continue to exist in this new, nightmarish reality? As the chapter closes, Eldor stands alone, a dark figure against the grey expanse, his fate as uncertain as the dying light that struggles to pierce the gloomy sky. The hunger within him is a burning fire, and the world stretches out, bleak and unyielding, before him. Chapter 2. A faint whisper of life. Eldur wandered through the vast ice-bound wasteland, each step a testament to his growing desperation. The landscape stretched endlessly before him, barren and devoid of any living soul, filled only with the staggering hordes of decaying undead. Amid the bleakness, a thought crept into his ancient, cunning mind. Do we share the curse of undeath? He murmured to himself, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. It was a notion that haunted the fringes of his thoughts, growing louder with each passing moment. Perhaps there was more, a hidden thread linking their damned existences. Driven by this new curiosity and the unbearable pangs of hunger tearing at his soul, Eldur approached a half-frozen, half-decayed zombie that shuffled aimlessly through the snow. He attempted to communicate, speaking the ancient tongue of the night, but the creature acted as though Eldur were no more than a wisp of air, a ghost in this ghostly world. His hunger mounting to an overwhelming crescendo, Eldur, in a burst of anger and despair, shifted into his shadow form. As a dark mist, he swept through the zombie. Instantly, the undead creature collapsed into a heap, lifeless once more, and truly dead. Surprised, and not a little alarmed by his own destructive power, Eldur paused to consider what had just occurred. This ability to end undeath, what did it signify? The gnawing hunger made it difficult to concentrate, but Eldur focused his energies once more, not to destroy, but to connect. Using his shadow form, he enveloped another wandering corpse, this time gently, trying to forge a link rather than sever it. The corpse slowly turned to face him, its milky eyes meeting his. Encouraged, Eldur whispered, "Food." Collapsing onto the cold ground, weakened by hunger and exertion, Eldur looked up as the undead creature pointed towards a distant place, its arm jerking awkwardly towards the horizon. The gesture was vague, but unmistakable. Eldur's heart, though it no longer beat, surged with a flicker of hope. Was he now able to communicate with these lost souls? With great effort, Eldur rose to his feet, his body aching and his mind weary. He began to walk in the direction indicated by the undead creature, each step fueled by the dual forces of desperation and the faintest whisper of possibility. Could this pointed direction lead him to a remnant of life, a haven in this desolate, post-apocalyptic tundra? The possibility pushed him forward, a dark figure moving through a sea of decay, clinging to the thin thread of hope that somewhere in this forsaken world, life persisted. In the frozen wilderness, a small, ramshackle outpost stood as a beacon of life amid the desolation. Inside, a handful of survivors went about their daily grind, checking the undead crowding against the outer walls, shoring up their defenses, and reinforcing barricades worn by constant assault. Among them, two men, John and Marcus, conversed wearily over their routine tasks. "There's thousands of them out there," John noted, a hint of fear in his voice. "But so far, they haven't figured out how to breach our walls. Let's just hope they don't all start thinking and rush us at once." Marcus scoffed. "They're just a walking mass of rotting flesh and no brains." Suddenly, a guard on watchtower duty shouted, drawing the attention of the outpost residents. "Hey, there's someone out there, and the undead aren't attacking him." Curious and cautious, the survivors gathered to peer out over the icy expanse. There, staggering towards their sanctuary, was Eldur. Despite the biting cold and his evident exhaustion, the undead seemed to ignore him, part in ways as he approached. "How is that possible?" one survivor whispered in disbelief. "Should we help him?" another pondered aloud. "No way we're going out there," a third retorted. Despite their reservations, Eldur's slow, determined crawl to the outpost's secure doorway intrigued and unnerved them. As he finally collapsed just outside their gates, the undead inexplicably backed away, leaving a clear space around him. "Bring him in, but be ready for anything," the leader decided. Quickly, the outpost crew swung open the doors and dragged Eldur inside. They stood around him, weapons drawn, guns and makeshift arms pointed at the enigmatic figure lying on their floor. Eldur, feeling the warmth of life around him, felt his ancient, predatory instincts surge. The hunger, momentarily forgotten, now screamed within him for release. One of the crew leaned in, concern etched on his face. "You okay, man?" In the blink of an eye, Eldur was upon him, fangs sunk deep into the man's neck, drawing lifeblood in deep, greedy gulps. As the crew scrambled to pull him off, the freshly consumed blood renewed Eldur's strength and power. He transformed into shadow, gliding eerily through each member of the crew. One by one, they collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Having gorged himself on their essence, Eldur stood and roared, his strength fully returned. He strode to the gates and threw them open. The undead, previously held at bay, began to flood into the outpost. With his power restored, Eldur turned to a nearby corpse. "More," he commanded in a tone that brooked no argument. Several undead turned their heads, pointing in a unified direction across the icy wastes. Climbing higher within the camp, Eldur focused his shadow form and amplified his command. "More!" Every undead within miles stopped in its tracks and pointed in a single direction. Eldur smiled, his plan taking shape. "Move!" he bellowed. The undead began to march, a vast, unthinking army under his command, heading towards an unknown destination that promised even more discoveries. Days after the fall of the small outpost, inside the heavily fortified walls of Fort Haven, concern was growing among the survivors. The sprawling survivor camp had become a beacon of human resilience amid the zombie apocalypse. Here, humanity still clung to hope, sustained by a robust infrastructure that rivaled small towns from the world before. "Have we heard from the outpost?" Samantha, the camp's logistics officer, inquired during their routine security briefing. "No, nothing for a couple of days," replied Captain Harris, the leader of their security team. His face was lined with worry, reflecting the gravity of losing contact with any part of their network. "We'll have to send someone out there," he concluded grimly. Fort Haven was a marvel of post-apocalyptic survival. Encircled by massive walls topped with electrified fencing, the camp was virtually impregnable to the undead hordes that roamed outside. Within these walls, life thrived with a vibrancy that seemed at odds with the outside world. The community sustained itself through a variety of ingenious methods. The heart of Fort Haven's sustainability lay in its agricultural practices. Rooftop gardens and carefully managed indoor farms produced a variety of fruits and vegetables, ensuring a steady supply of food. Livestock was kept in secured barns, and every scrap of organic waste was turned into compost to fertilize the crops. Power was another critical component of their self-sufficiency. A combination of solar panels, wind turbines, and backup generators ensured that Fort Haven had a continuous supply of electricity. This power not only kept the lights on and the electric fences hot, but also powered the water purification systems that made rainwater and recycled water safe for consumption. In terms of defense, Fort Haven was equally prepared. The walls were patrolled by guards equipped with rifles and crossbows, supplemented by CCTV cameras and motion sensors that triggered alarms at the slightest hint of an undead breach. Every resident received basic combat training, and regular drills kept their skills sharp. The community was a mix of individuals from all walks of life who had banded together in the face of apocalypse. Among them was Dr. Emily Jiang, a biologist who managed the farming operations and worked on biofuel alternatives. Then there was Leo, a mechanical engineer who kept the generators running and improvised many of the camp's technological adaptations. As the meeting continued, the decision was made to send a reconnaissance team to investigate the silence from the outpost. The team would include Marco, a former park ranger known for his survival skills, and Jenna, a communications specialist who could potentially re-establish contact with the outpost. Their mission was critical. The loss of the outpost wasn't just a strategic blow, it was a potential sign of evolving threats in a world where the balance between life and undeath was perpetually precarious. Fort Haven wasn't just surviving, it was a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, a community determined to reclaim a future from the clutches of apocalypse. Marco and Jenna, equipped with survival gear and ample provisions, revved up an old snowmobile that had been modified to run on biofuel. The vehicle, a relic of pre-apocalypse days, burst out of Fort Haven's secure gates. Ready to brave the icy wilderness, they sped across the barren landscape, navigating skillfully around the sparsely distributed undead that roamed aimlessly in the cold. The snowmobile's engine growled beneath them, a reassuring sound against the eerie silence of the frozen wasteland. After an hour of travel, Marco slowed the vehicle to a cautious crawl. Ahead, the terrain opened up into a wide plain, and his sharp eyes caught a disturbing sight. "Look there," he said, pointing out to Jenna. In the distance, a massive wall of undead advanced, thousands upon thousands, all moving in a unified, ominous march. The sheer number was staggering, a living sea of decay and death, each step vibrating through the frozen ground. "We need to turn back. We cannot get through them," Marco declared, the urgency in his voice mirroring the grave situation unfolding before them. Jenna nodded in agreement, her eyes wide with the realization of the impending danger. They quickly spun the snowmobile around and sped back toward the safety of Fort Haven. The sight of the advancing horde, a relentless army driven by some unseen force, sent a chill deeper than the icy wind that whipped around them. At the heart of this macabre procession was Eldur, his figure almost imperceptible among the sea of decaying bodies. His connection to the undead strengthened with each passing moment, his ancient mind constantly calculating the reasons behind this newfound control. Like the undead horde, he was driven by a singular, overwhelming desire to feed. Unbeknownst to the survivors at Fort Haven, Eldur was not just a survivor of a bygone era, he was a harbinger of a darker future, weaving his will into the fabric of the undead's mindless wanderings. As Marco and Jenna raced back to warn their community, the true scale of the threat they faced began to dawn on them. Eldor's march was not random, it was purposeful, and Fort Haven lay directly in its path. As Marco and Jenna raced through the gates of Fort Haven, their arrival was met with immediate concern. The gates clanged shut behind them, the sound echoing ominously through the compound. Captain Harris approached quickly, his expression questioning. "Why are you back so soon? What happened out there?" Marco, catching his breath, relayed their alarming discovery. "There's a massive horde coming this way, and it's like nothing we've seen before. They seemed organized, almost strategic in their movements. Thousands of them, all marching in the same direction. Here." The leader, Commander Lewis, furrowed his brow, a mix of skepticism and worry in his voice. "Organized? How is that possible? They're mindless." "We don't know, but we saw it with our own eyes," Jenna added, her voice firm despite her visible anxiety. Commander Lewis turned to Captain Harris. "Do you think the fort can withstand such an assault?" Under normal circumstances, Harris would have been confident in their defences, but the report shook him. Yes, the walls will hold against a typical siege, but if they're truly organised, climbing over each other, our electrified defences might burn out under the strain. We need to prepare for the worst. At that moment, another team member, Sylvia, spoke up. "I heard about another camp, far inland, that managed to defeat the undead with ease. I'm not sure how they did it, though." "That might be worth looking into," Commander Lewis mused, his mind racing with possibilities. "But right now, we need to focus on fortifying our defences. We have just over a day before they arrive." The community sprang into action, bolstering their defences with a renewed urgency. Extra supplies were brought up to the walls, additional electrified fencing was set up, and every able-bodied person was enlisted to help reinforce the barricades. Watchtowers were manned around the clock, with sharpshooters ready to take down any undead that came too close. In the war room, the leaders and security teams pored over maps and surveillance footage, planning their tactics. Harris and his team rehearsed various scenarios, calculating the best responses to a range of possible undead behaviours. The atmosphere in Fort Haven grew tense as the hours ticked down. Each member of the community knew the gravity of the situation. They were not just fighting for their lives, but for the very existence of one of the last bastions of humanity in a world overrun by darkness. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the fortified camp, all eyes were on the horizon, watching, waiting for the impending storm of undead that threatened to engulf them. The tension at Fort Haven reached its peak as the lookout shouted from atop the wall, his voice strained with urgency. "I see them. There are thousands." Captain Harris quickly grabbed his binoculars, scanning the horizon. What he saw made his heart sink. "My God," he muttered, disbelief and fear mingling in his eyes. "The walls won't hold. There are too many of them." "We may need to evacuate," he announced grimly to the others who had gathered around him. As the wall of undead moved ever closer, the camp's leaders hastily organised evacuation plans, while every able-bodied person readied themselves for the wave of death and decay that was bearing down on them. But just as the Horde came within range, something unexpected happened. It stopped. The occupants of Fort Haven watched in astonishment as the mass of undead bodies parted, creating a path through the middle like a sea making way for its commander. A solitary figure appeared from the opening. It was Eldor, the ancient vampire. They had yet to meet, but whose presence they had already felt. He walked calmly towards the front of Fort Haven, stopping just short of the range of their weapons. Then, with an eerie casualness, he waved and called out, "Hello? Want to talk it over?" Captain Harris, bewildered and cautious, spoke from a watchtower above the entrance. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Eldor's response chilled the air further. "Oh, not much. Just your blood. I could have my friends overrun your nice little camp here, or you can give it to me willingly. Just send out 10 warm-blooded specimens for me, and I'll tell them to go away." "You know we can't do that. We won't sacrifice our people to you," Harris responded firmly, his voice echoing across the silent standoff. Eldor laughed, a cold, menacing sound that seemed to mock their resolve. "Good," he said with a smirk. He turned to walk back to the undead horde when a guard on the wall, overcome by fear and defiance, fired at him. Eldor immediately shifted into shadow, evading the bullet with supernatural ease. He turned back, his form coalescing from the darkness, and spoke with a venomous tone. "Your time will come. You hunted me and caused me years of suffering. I can't wait to return the favor." With that ominous threat, Eldur emerged back into the sea of undead, which closed behind him like dark waters, swallowing the last glimmer of light. The people of Fort Haven were left to ponder their grim options, the silence of the moment heavy with the weight of impending doom. As the undead resumed their relentless march toward Fort Haven, the anxiety among the survivors peaked. Captain Harris, observing the advancing horde, spoke urgently. "He's controlling them somehow." Commander Lewis, trying to grasp the situation, questioned, "Who is this person?" "No idea, sir, but he looks old," replied Captain Harris, his eyes fixed on the approaching threat. As the wall of death drew closer, Captain Harris made a decisive call. "Open fire," he commanded. The air filled with the sound of gunfire as bullets tore through the decaying bodies. Rotting corpses fell to the ground, but it was like firing into an endless wave. Their numbers were too vast for any attack to make a significant impact. It wasn't long before the undead reached the walls. Desperate, they began to climb over each other, forming grisly towers of decay. As they hit the electrified fences, sheer number overwhelmed the system, causing it to burn out quickly. From his vantage point, Eldor watched with a perverse anticipation, licking his lips as he awaited his next feast. Soon, the undead were climbing over the walls, unstoppable in their advance. They grabbed one of the fort's guards, and instead of attacking him directly, they dragged him from one undead to another, passing him along like a macabre conveyor belt of decay, until he was delivered to Eldur. Eldur smiled cruelly, and in a flash, he was upon the guard, draining him of life and gaining more strength. One by one, other guards were dragged to Eldur by the undead, each being passed from decaying hand to decaying hand until they reached their grim fate. Eldur drank and gorged himself on their lifeblood. Realizing the hopelessness of their situation, Captain Harris made a grim decision. "We're doomed. Retreat," he ordered. The remaining occupants of Fort Haven quickly followed their evacuation plan, fleeing through the back exits and secret passages designed for just such a nightmare scenario. Eldur, having fed on 9 of the guards, stood amidst the chaos, sinister satisfaction in his gaze. "Ah, I asked for 10. 1 short," he remarked casually. He then melted into the shadows and whisked himself to the gate, opening it wider to allow the flood of undead to pour into what was now his domain. "Think I'll stay here for a while. I quite like the place." "Fort Eldur," he declared, renaming the conquered fort with a tone of dark triumph. As the last of the human resistance disappeared into the icy wilderness, Eldur settled into his new stronghold, surrounded by the undead, a ruler of a desolate kingdom of decay. The survivors of Fort Haven trudged wearily through the frozen landscape, the biting wind cutting through their thick clothes. The march from the fallen camp was solemn, each step heavy with loss and despair. They had lost their stronghold and many friends in the assault. Now they headed towards a distant outpost, days away, their path marked by the necessity of cutting through stray undead that loomed in their way. Back in the fort now claimed as his domain, Eldur had fashioned a makeshift throne room from remnants found within the walls. He sat regally on a chair draped with colourful curtains he had discovered, his grin malevolent. "Chase me in the ice," he mused aloud, a reference to the relentless pursuit he had once endured. Rising from his throne, Eldur moved to an overlook of his newly named Fort Eldur. He shouted to the undead masses below, "Where is life?" In unison, The hordes pointed in a single direction, and his smile widened, his dark plans unfurling before him. Meanwhile, among the weary column of human survivors, Captain Harris sought more information from Sylvia about a potential haven. "Tell me more about this camp that defeated the undead," he urged, hoping for a shred of hope amid their bleak predicament. Sylvia glanced at him, her expression mixed with hesitation and faint hope. "Well, it's mostly a rumor I picked up during my travels," she began cautiously. "There's a camp that had vampires to protect it from the undead, but it's said that the vampires eventually defected, choosing to work with the undead. Somehow, they managed to destroy every undead within miles in seconds. But remember, it's only something I heard." Captain Harris nodded, processing this information. The idea that vampires could be both a threat and a potential ally was perplexing, yet it hinted at possibilities they had not considered. Could there be a way to use such power to their advantage? Or was it merely another peril in a world already brimming with dangers? As they continued their march, the survivors clung to each piece of hope, discussing strategies and potential allies in hushed tones. The journey was harsh, and the cold unrelenting, but the human spirit, resilient in the face of such adversities, spurred them onward. In the distance, the vague outline of what could be salvation or another battle loomed, a reminder of the ever-present struggle for survival in a world turned nightmarish. Days of relentless marching through the harsh, frozen landscape finally brought the survivors of Fort Haven to a small outpost. Exhausted but relieved to find shelter, the group was met with a mixture of welcome and wariness. The outpost, built for just a handful of people, now faced the daunting task of supporting the newcomers. The leader of the refugees, Captain Harris, explained their dire situation to the head of the outpost, detailing the fall of Fort Haven and the terrifying power of Eldor, who now controlled hordes of undead. "We need a longer-term solution," Captain Harris concluded, the weariness evident in his voice. The outpost leader nodded in agreement, his brow furrowed with concern. "There is another camp," the outpost leader began, "miles from here, where they've reportedly found a way to eliminate the undead threat. After a huge battle, they managed to kill every undead for miles in mere moments." Captain Harris's interest piqued. "We could use this technology," he mused aloud, the possibility igniting a spark of hope among the weary survivors. Meanwhile, back at Fort Eldur, Eldor stood commanding his vast undead army with a chilling calm. His control over the undead had grown stronger with each passing day, his powers reaching further as he commanded more and more of the walking dead. With a simple command, "Move," the undead began their relentless march towards the outpost, driven by Eldor's will. Bolstered with fresh kills from their recent conquests, Eldor's powers were at their peak, and the undead horde swelled, gathering more walking corpses as it advanced. The small outpost, now a refuge for the entire inhabitants of Fort Haven, braced for an overwhelming siege. The survivors quickly set about fortifying their new home, utilizing every resource and tool at their disposal. They knew the stakes: survive Eldor's onslaught or perish. As the undead horde drew nearer, the tension within the outpost reached a fever pitch. Captain Harris and the outpost leader coordinated their defenses, rallying everyone to prepare for the battle that could determine their fate. Will the survivors find the rumored technology in time to stop Eldor's march of the dead? Will they be able to hold off the undead army long enough to escape to the distant camp? These questions hang in the air as the scene is set for a desperate struggle for survival. Stay tuned for the continuation in Crimson Dawn Series 2, where the fate of the survivors and the battle against the undead will unfold in new, thrilling chapters. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey. If your thirst for the unknown and the unexplained is still unquenched, I invite you to delve deeper into the abyss of terror. Just beyond the veil of reality, another story awaits to send shivers down your spine. Dare to join me in the next video, where the unknown becomes known and the unseen seen. Until then, keep the lights dim and your mind open. This is Professor Shadow, signing off.